subscribe to my YouTube channel for deeply emotional, romantic, and mature stories that echo through your heart. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support meaningful storytelling. Sarah Martinez had always believed that love was transparent, that after 12 years of marriage, she could read her husband David like an open book. But sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones harboring the deepest secrets, and sometimes those secrets aren't what we expect them to be. The first crack in her certainty appeared on a Tuesday evening in late September, when David came home later than usual, his tie slightly askew and something distant flickering in his dark eyes. He kissed her forehead with the same gentle affection he'd shown for over a decade, but Sarah felt something different, a weight he was carrying that hadn't been there that morning. "How was work?" she asked, stirring the pasta sauce that had been simmering for the past hour. "Fine," David replied, loosening his tie completely. "Just busy. You know how it is with the Peterson account." Sarah nodded, though something in his voice made her pause. She knew David's work rhythms, his stress patterns, the way his shoulders tensed when deadlines loomed. This was different. This felt personal. Over the next few weeks, the subtle changes multiplied like ripples across still water. David would receive text messages that made him smile in a way that seemed both guilty and grateful. He started working late more frequently, and when Sarah suggested bringing him dinner at the office, something she'd done countless times before, he quickly declined, saying he didn't want to disturb the team's focus. The team, that was new terminology. David had always talked about his colleagues by name, especially Marcus Chen, his project partner of 3 years. Now everything was the team, or work stuff, or simply complicated. Sarah found herself studying her husband across their breakfast table, watching the way he scrolled through his phone with an intensity that seemed to consume him entirely. His coffee would grow cold as he typed rapid responses to messages that arrived at all hours. When she asked who was texting so early, he'd wave dismissively and mention something about client communications across time zones. But Sarah had been married to David long enough to know the difference between his work face and his personal face. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just business. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon when Sarah decided to surprise David with lunch from his favorite deli. She hadn't been to his office in months, and the thought of seeing his face light up when she appeared unexpectedly filled her with the kind of warm anticipation that had sustained their marriage through its various seasons. The elevator to the 15th floor seemed to take forever, and Sarah found herself checking her reflection in the polished steel doors. At 34, she still felt young, though she wondered sometimes if David saw the subtle changes that 12 years and the stress of trying to conceive had etched around her eyes. They'd stopped talking about children recently, another conversation that had quietly disappeared from their repertoire. When the doors opened, Sarah was greeted by the familiar hum of the accounting firm where David had worked his way up from junior associate to senior partner. The receptionist, Janet, smiled warmly and waved her through without question. Sarah had been here dozens of times before, but today something felt different about the atmosphere. There was an energy, an undercurrent of whispered conversations and meaningful glances between colleagues. She made her way toward David's corner office, past the maze of cubicles and conference rooms. Through the glass walls, she could see people hunched over computers, phones pressed to ears, the usual choreography of corporate life. But as she approached David's office, she noticed his door was closed, unusual for a Friday afternoon, and voices were coming from within. Sarah paused, her hand raised to knock, when she heard something that made her blood run cold. Not the words themselves, but the tone. David was speaking in a voice she recognized but hadn't heard in years. The soft, careful cadence he used when he was trying to comfort someone, when he was being unutterably gentle. "I know this is hard," she heard him say through the door, "but you don't have to carry this alone anymore." A woman's voice responded, too quiet for Sarah to make out the words, but the emotion was unmistakable. Whoever was in there with her husband was crying. Sarah's first instinct was to knock anyway, to announce herself and discover what crisis was unfolding in David's office. But something held her back, a combination of social propriety and a growing dread that she wasn't prepared to face whatever was happening behind that door. Instead, she found herself stepping back, moving toward the small break room adjacent to David's office. From there, she could see his door through the glass partition, could wait for whoever was with him to emerge. She didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, the door opened, and Sarah watched as Elena Rodriguez, David's newest colleague, stepped out. Elena was probably 28, with the kind of polished professional appearance that Sarah had once maintained before settling into the comfortable routines of married life. But today, Elena's composure was fractured, her eyes were red, rimmed, her usually perfect makeup slightly smudged. David appeared in the doorway behind her, and Sarah watched as he placed a gentle hand on Elena's shoulder. The gesture was brief, appropriate for a workplace, but there was something in the way Elena looked up at him, gratitude mixed with something deeper, more complicated. "Thank you," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet hallway. "I don't know what I would have done without." "You would have figured it out," David replied. "You're stronger than you think." Elena nodded, gathered herself visibly, and walked toward the elevators. David watched her go, and in his face Sarah saw an expression she hadn't seen directed toward anyone but herself in over a decade. It wasn't romantic, exactly, but it was intimate in a way that made Sarah's chest tighten. When David returned to his office, Sarah remained frozen in the break room, her husband's lunch growing cold in its takeout container. She felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one more step would change everything, but unable to turn around and pretend she hadn't seen what she'd just witnessed. Her phone buzzed, a text from David, "Working late tonight, don't wait up, love you." The casual intimacy of those 3 words they'd exchanged thousands of times suddenly felt like a lie. Not because Sarah doubted David's love for her, but because she realized there were entire portions of his emotional life that she was no longer privy to. That night, Sarah lay in bed listening to David's key in the front door at nearly midnight. She heard him move quietly through the house, trying not to wake her, the same consideration he'd always shown. When he slipped into bed beside her, she could smell his cologne mixed with something else, not perfume, but the scent of someone else's space, someone else's crisis. "Sarah," he whispered, "you awake?" She almost answered, almost turned to him and asked directly what was happening with Elena, what crisis required such late nights and gentle voices. Instead, she kept her breathing steady and pretended to sleep, buying herself time to figure out how to navigate whatever truth was waiting for her. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself becoming a detective in her own marriage. She paid attention to David's phone habits, to the way he dressed for work, to the subtle changes in his vocabulary. She noticed that he'd started mentioning Elena more frequently, always in professional contexts, but with a familiarity that suggested their interactions had deepened beyond typical colleague relationships. Elena had an interesting perspective on the Morrison project. He might say over dinner, or "Elena thinks we should approach the quarterly review differently." Each mention of Elena's name felt like a small betrayal, not because David was being secretive, but because Sarah could hear something in his voice when he talked about her, a respect and interest. That felt newly engaged in a way that David's work discussions rarely did. The worst part was that Sarah genuinely liked what she knew about Elena. The few times they'd met at office parties, Elena had been warm and intelligent, asking thoughtful questions about Sarah's work as a freelance graphic designer and remembering details from previous conversations. She was the kind of woman Sarah might have chosen as a friend under different circumstances. But these weren't different circumstances. These were the circumstances where Sarah's husband was staying late to offer comfort to a beautiful younger colleague, where intimate conversations were happening behind closed doors, where Sarah felt like a stranger in her own marriage. 3 weeks after the lunch incident, Sarah's suspicions crystallized into a plan. David had mentioned working late again, and Sarah decided she needed to know exactly what working late entailed. She parked across the street from David's office building at 7:30, feeling ridiculous and desperate, but unable to stop herself. She watched the windows of the 15th floor, trying to identify which lights belonged to David's office. Most of the building had emptied by 8 o'clock, but several windows remained illuminated. Sarah found herself imagining what was happening behind those lit windows, her mind cycling through scenarios that ranged from innocent overtime to intimate confessions. At 9:15, she saw David emerge from the building, but he wasn't alone. Elena walked beside him, and even from across the street, Sarah could see that they were deep in conversation. They stood outside the building for several minutes, talking with the kind of intensity that suggested the conversation was important to both of them. Then Elena did something that made Sarah's breath catch. She reached out and briefly touched David's arm, a gesture of connection that spoke of comfort given and received. David covered her hand with his own for just a moment before they separated, Elena walking toward the parking garage while David headed in the opposite direction. Sarah sat in her car for another 20 minutes, trying to process what she'd seen. It wasn't romantic in any obvious way, but it was intimate in a manner that felt like a betrayal of the exclusivity she'd believed she shared with David. Whoever Elena was to her husband, she wasn't just a colleague anymore. When David arrived home that night, Sarah was waiting in the living room with a cup of tea she didn't want and a dozen questions she couldn't figure out how to ask. "How was work?" she said, the same question she'd been asking for 12 years, but this time loaded with new meaning. "Long," David replied, settling into his usual spot on the couch beside her. "Elena's been dealing with some difficult personal stuff, and it's been affecting her work performance. I've been trying to help her navigate it." The casual way he offered this information surprised Sarah. She'd expected evasion, but David seemed almost relieved to be talking about it. "What kind of personal stuff?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. David was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could see him weighing how much to share. "Her marriage is falling apart," he said finally. "Her husband. He's not a good man, Sarah. Elena's been dealing with some really difficult situations at home, and she's been trying to keep it separate from work, but it's been impossible." The words hit Sarah like cold water. Elena wasn't the other woman she'd been imagining. Elena was a woman in crisis, turning to David for the kind of support and guidance that David had always been generous in offering to friends and colleagues. "She asked me not to discuss it with anyone," David continued, "which is why I've been vague about the late nights. She's embarrassed about the situation, and she's worried that people at work will judge her or treat her differently if they know what's happening at home." Sarah felt her carefully constructed narrative of betrayal crumbling. "What kind of difficult situations?" she asked. David's expression darkened. "The kind that make a person afraid to go home," he said quietly. "Elena's husband has been controlling, and recently it's escalated beyond just emotional manipulation." The weight of David's words settled over Sarah like a heavy blanket. Elena wasn't trying to steal her husband. Elena was trying to escape from her own. "She's been staying late at the office because she's afraid to go home," David continued. "And I've been staying with her because I remember what it was like when my sister was in a similar situation. I remember how isolated she felt, how much it meant to have someone who believed her and supported her." Sarah did remember David's sister, Jessica, and the abusive relationship that had nearly destroyed her 5 years earlier. She remembered the late-night phone calls, the careful conversations, the way David had thrown himself into helping Jessica find the resources and support she needed to leave safely. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. Because Alina asked me not to tell anyone, and because— David paused, looking directly at her. Because I knew you'd want to help, and I was worried that too many people knowing would make Alina feel exposed in a way that might push her back towards staying silent. It was a reasonable explanation, and Sarah could see the logic in David's discretion. But it didn't completely address the feeling of exclusion she'd been experiencing, the sense that there were important parts of David's emotional life that he was no longer sharing with her. I felt shut out, Sarah said, surprising herself with her directness. David turned to face her fully, and Sarah saw something in his expression that looked like relief mixed with regret. I know, he said. I felt terrible about it, but I didn't know how to balance Alina's need for privacy with my need to talk to you about what was happening. It's been eating at me. They sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the conversation and its implications. Sarah realized that her marriage wasn't threatened by Alina's presence in David's life, but it had been impacted by the secrecy surrounding that presence. What happens now? Sarah asked. Alina's filing for divorce next week, David said. She's been working with a lawyer, getting her finances in order, making sure she has a safe place to go. The late nights have been about practical planning as much as emotional support. Sarah nodded, feeling a complex mixture of relief and guilt. Relief that her marriage wasn't in jeopardy, and guilt that she'd spent weeks suspecting David of betrayal when he'd been trying to help someone in genuine crisis. I want to help, Sarah said, and she meant it. David smiled for the first time in weeks, the kind of full, genuine smile that had made Sarah fall in love with him 15 years earlier. I hoped you'd say that, he said. Alina's going to need practical support over the next few months, help moving, maybe temporary housing while she gets settled. I didn't want to volunteer our guest room without talking to you first. The conversation continued late into the night, with David sharing details about Alina's situation and Sarah beginning to transform from suspicious wife to supportive ally. They talked about the resources available for women leaving abusive relationships, about the legal and practical challenges Alina would face, about how they could best offer support without overstepping boundaries. By the time they went to bed, Sarah felt like she and David were partners again, in a way they hadn't been for months. The secrecy had created distance between them, but the truth was bringing them back together. The following week, Sarah met Alina for coffee, not as the suspicious wife checking up on her husband's colleague, but as a woman offering support to another woman in crisis. Alina was nervous at first, clearly uncertain about how much David had shared and worried about being judged. David told me about your situation, Sarah said gently. I want you to know that if you need anything practical help, a place to stay, just someone to talk to, we're here for you. Alina's eyes filled with tears, but this time they seemed to be tears of relief rather than despair. I was so worried about imposing on your marriage, she said. David has been incredibly kind, but I know how it might look, him staying late to help me, keeping it private. It looked exactly like what it was, Sarah replied. My husband helping someone who needed help. That's who he is, and it's one of the reasons I love him. Over the following months, Sarah watched Alina navigate the difficult process of leaving her marriage and rebuilding her life. There were legal complications, financial challenges, and moments of doubt when Alina wondered if she was making the right choice. But there were also victories, small acts of reclaimed independence, growing confidence, the gradual return of Alina's natural warmth and humor. David continued to offer professional mentorship and practical support, but now Sarah was part of that support system too. She helped Alina find a therapist, accompanied her to apartment viewings, and offered the kind of friendship that Alina had been isolated from during her marriage. 6 months after that first suspicious afternoon at David's office, Sarah found herself reflecting on how wrong her initial assumptions had been. She'd been so focused on protecting her marriage from an imagined threat that she'd almost missed the opportunity to strengthen it through shared purpose and generosity. Alina did stay in their guest room for 3 weeks while her apartment lease was processed, and during that time, Sarah discovered that her marriage was actually enhanced by having another person witness its daily rhythms. Alina's presence reminded Sarah and David of the things they did well together, their easy communication, their shared sense of humor, their instinctive kindness toward people in need. "You two are lucky," Alina said one evening as the three of them finished dinner on the back patio. "I'd forgotten what a good partnership looked like." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed David's hand, feeling grateful not just for their marriage, but for the reminder that love sometimes grows stronger when it's extended beyond the couple who shares it. A year later, Alina was settled in her new life, thriving in her career, and beginning to date again carefully, thoughtfully, with the hard won wisdom of someone who'd learned to recognize her own worth. She remained close friends with both Sarah and David, but the crisis that had brought them together had resolved into something more comfortable and sustainable. Sarah realized that her moment of suspicion had taught her something valuable about trust and communication in marriage. The problem hadn't been David's relationship with Alina. It had been Sarah's exclusion from understanding that relationship. When David had felt forced to choose between Alina's privacy and Sarah's inclusion, he'd chosen Alina's immediate needs, but the secrecy had created unnecessary tension. "I should have found a way to tell you what was happening without violating Alina's confidence," David said one evening as they walked through their neighborhood, a routine they'd rediscovered during Alina's crisis. "And I should have asked directly instead of letting my imagination create problems that didn't exist," Sarah replied. They'd both learned something about the balance between individual relationships and marriage, about the way loyalty to friends and loyalty to spouses could coexist without conflict when handled with openness and trust. 2 years later, when Sarah finally became pregnant after years of trying, Alina was one of the first people they called. And when their daughter was born, Alina became the kind of family friend who wasn't related by blood, but who was woven into the fabric of their lives through shared experience and mutual care. Sarah sometimes thought about that afternoon when she'd stood outside David's office, convinced that her marriage was under threat. She'd been both right and wrong right that something significant was happening in David's emotional life, wrong about what it meant for their relationship. The real threat to their marriage hadn't been another woman. It had been the assumption that love was a finite resource, that David's capacity for caring about Alina somehow diminished his capacity for caring about Sarah. Instead, Sarah had discovered that love, when practiced generously and with clear communication, actually expanded to encompass more people and deeper connections. Years later, when friends asked Sarah about the secret to a lasting marriage, she would think about Alina and David and that difficult period of secrecy and suspicion. Marriage, she learned, wasn't about knowing everything about your partner. It was about trusting them enough to navigate the things you didn't know together. Sometimes the people we think we know best are harboring secrets. But sometimes those secrets aren't betrayals, they're acts of kindness that make us love them even more deeply once we understand their true nature. Sarah had thought she knew her husband completely, but she'd been wrong. She'd known his capacity for loyalty and love, but she hadn't fully understood the breadth of his compassion or the depth of his commitment to helping people in crisis. Learning these things about David hadn't changed their marriage. It had deepened it, adding new dimensions to her understanding of the man she'd chosen to spend her life with. And perhaps that's what lasting love really means, not the absence of surprises, but the trust that whatever surprises come will ultimately serve to strengthen rather than threaten the bond between two people who have chosen to build a life together. In the end, Sarah realized she had known her husband all along. She just needed to learn to trust what she knew,